Racist cop targets homeless black veteran. What happens next will leave you stunned. Hey everyone, before we jump into today's emotional and eye-opening story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We're always bringing you powerful stories that remind us just how important it is to stand up and protect the ones we love. Also, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop a comment below and let us know what country you're tuning in from. It's always amazing to see how far these stories reach and connect us all across the world. Now let's get into this. It was another cold, bitter winter morning in the city of Portland. The sky hung low, a dull blanket of gray casting a cold, indifferent shadow over the streets. Frost clung stubbornly to the sidewalks, and the early risers wrapped themselves tightly in coats, rushing through the chill. The city bustled as usual, but to some, it was just another long, punishing day of survival. One such man was Isaiah Johnson. Isaiah, a former Army veteran, had seen better days. At 42 years old, he had once been strong, vibrant, and full of hope. He had served in the Army for 10 years, deploying to Afghanistan twice. Like many who returned home from the horrors of war, he carried invisible scars. His body had returned to the United States, but his mind was still on the battlefield, haunted by memories of loss, violence, and destruction. He had been diagnosed with PTSD shortly after returning from his last deployment, and the transition back to civilian life had been anything but smooth. For Isaiah, the hardships compounded. He struggled to find steady work and keep a job. His mental health deteriorated, his marriage collapsed, and one thing led to another until he found himself homeless. The government assistance he received was minimal, and the promise of help for veterans was often nothing more than hollow words. Isaiah now lived on the streets of Portland, his only possessions contained in an old, worn-out backpack. Most days, he stayed near a busy intersection under the shelter of a bridge, holding a cardboard sign that read, "Homeless veteran, please help, God bless." He didn't beg or shout at passers-by, but his weathered face and hunched posture spoke volumes to anyone who cared to look. That morning, as he sat quietly with his sign in hand, he noticed the usual flow of people avoiding eye contact as they passed him by. Some hurriedly tossed a few coins his way, but most just walked on, lost in their own worlds. Isaiah was used to it by now. He was invisible to most of the city, just another homeless black man in a system that had long since abandoned him. But not everyone was ignoring him. Standing across the street, Officer Kyle Harrington was watching Isaiah with cold, calculating eyes. Harrington had been with the Portland Police Department for over a decade and had earned a reputation for being harsh, especially toward the homeless population. However, it was his particular disdain for black people that set him apart. He hid his racism behind a badge, using his authority to harass, intimidate, and brutalize people of color without consequence. In his eyes, Isaiah was the perfect target. A homeless black man on a corner, with no power, no voice, and no one to defend him. Today, Harrington had made up his mind. He was going to deal with Isaiah once and for all. Harrington crossed the street with heavy, deliberate steps, his hand already resting on his belt as he approached. His presence commanded attention, and a few passers-by slowed their pace, sensing that something was about to go down. Isaiah looked up from his sign, his eyes narrowing as he saw the officer approaching. He had dealt with the police before. Most of the time they moved him along with a cold word or a dismissive gesture. But there was something different in this officer's stance, in the way he walked toward him with a sneer on his face. "Hey you!" Harrington barked, standing over Isaiah. His voice was sharp, laced with contempt. "You can't sit here. This is loitering, and I'm not going to tell you again." Isaiah didn't move right away. He wasn't causing any trouble. He wasn't blocking anyone or doing anything illegal. His body ached from the cold, and his pride refused to let him rise so quickly just because this cop had an attitude. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Isaiah said, his voice quiet but firm. "Just sitting here, trying to get enough for a meal." Harrington sneered, his hand inching closer to his taser. "Oh, really? Just sitting here, huh? What, you think because you're a veteran, you get a free pass to break the law?" Isaiah bristled at the tone in Harrington's voice. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with someone who saw him as less than human, but the badge on Harrington's chest made the situation more dangerous. Isaiah could feel the tension rising in the air. his muscles stiffening as his instincts from his combat days began to kick in. "I'm not breaking any law," Isaiah said slowly, rising to his feet to avoid being manhandled. He was trying to keep his composure. "I served this country. I just need a little help." Harrington let out a short, bitter laugh. "Oh, right, a hero, huh? Bet you think everyone owes you something because of that uniform. Guess what? No one cares. You people are all the same, lazy, always looking for a handout." The words cut deep. Isaiah's jaw clenched, his heart pounding in his chest. You people. It wasn't the first time he had heard those words, but they never got easier. They always came from people who saw him as nothing more than his skin color, as a burden to society rather than a human being who had risked everything for the country they lived in. "I don't want trouble," Isaiah said, his voice tense, "just trying to survive." Harrington's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being talked back to, especially not by a black man, especially not one who thought he had some kind of moral high ground. Without warning, Harrington grabbed Isaiah by the arm, twisting it behind his back in one swift motion. Isaiah gasped in pain, the sudden force shocking his already aching body. "What the hell, man?" Isaiah shouted, wincing as Harrington forced him to the ground. "Stop resisting," Harrington yelled, even though Isaiah wasn't resisting at all. The cop's knee pressed into Isaiah's back, pinning him to the freezing sidewalk as onlookers began to gather. "Leave him alone," a young woman shouted from across the street, pulling out her phone to record the scene. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Others began to pull out their phones as well, capturing the scene unfolding in front of them. Harrington ignored them, his grip on Isaiah tightening as he roughly slapped handcuffs onto his wrists. "You're under arrest for loitering and resisting arrest," Harrington spat, hauling Isaiah to his feet. Isaiah's head spun as he struggled to catch his breath. His mind raced back to the combat zones of Afghanistan, the feeling of being powerless, outnumbered, and vulnerable. But this wasn't a war zone. This was home. Yet here he was, being treated like an enemy. As Harrington shoved Isaiah toward the squad car, the crowd of onlookers grew louder, their outrage rising. One man stepped forward, shouting, "You can't treat him like that. He didn't do anything." Harrington shot the man a glare, but didn't say anything as he roughly pushed Isaiah into the back seat of the police car. The door slammed shut, and the crowd watched in stunned silence as the car sped off, disappearing down the street. The arrest was quick, but the fallout wasn't. Within hours, the videos taken by the onlookers had spread like wildfire on social media. The footage clearly showed Isaiah quietly sitting with his sign before being violently accosted by Officer Harrington. Outrage poured in from all corners as people demanded answers and justice. The fact that Isaiah was a veteran only made the situation worse. How could a man who had served his country with honor be treated like this? And for what? Sitting on a sidewalk trying to survive, Sarah Mitchell, a local investigative journalist, was one of the first to pick up the story. She had made a name for herself by exposing police corruption, and this incident with Isaiah was right in her wheelhouse. Sarah wasted no time in digging into Harrington's past, and what she found was disturbing. Harrington had a long history of complaints against him. Many of those complaints had been from people of color, alleging racial profiling, harassment, and excessive force. But each time, the complaints were either ignored or brushed aside by his superiors. Harrington had managed to escape accountability for years, protected by a system that turned a blind eye to the abuses of power within its ranks. When Sarah reached out to Isaiah after his release from jail, he was still reeling from the experience. His wrists were bruised, his back ached from being thrown to the ground, and his pride was shattered. But more than that, he was angry. Not just for himself, but for all the others who had been mistreated by the very people who were supposed to protect them. "They think because I'm homeless and black that I don't matter," Isaiah told Sarah, his voice heavy with frustration. "But I served this country. I fought for it. And this is how they repay me? By treating me like I'm nothing?" Isaiah's story quickly gained traction, spreading across the country. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, and even politicians spoke out, demanding that Officer Harrington be held accountable for his actions. Protests erupted in Portland, with hundreds of people marching in support of Isaiah and against police brutality. Under mounting pressure, the Portland Police Department was forced to launch an investigation into Harrington's conduct. The footage was undeniable, and as more witnesses came forward, the department had no choice but to place Harrington on administrative leave. As the investigation unfolded, more damning evidence against Harrington came to light. Not only had he harassed and brutalized Isaiah, but his pattern of racist behavior had been an open secret within the department for years. Officers who had worked with him described a man who took pleasure in targeting minorities, using his badge as a shield for his bigotry. Harrington was eventually fired from the force, and criminal charges were brought against him for assault and misconduct. The case became a rallying cry for police reform, with many calling for stricter accountability and oversight within law enforcement. As for Isaiah, his life changed in ways he never expected. The attention brought to his case led to an outpouring of support from across the nation. Donations flooded in, and with the help of veterans organizations, Isaiah was able to find permanent housing and receive the mental health care he desperately needed. But more than that, Isaiah had found his voice. He began speaking out for other homeless veterans and marginalized communities, using his platform to advocate for change. His story had opened the eyes of many, shining a light on the systemic issues that had allowed officers like Harrington to operate with impunity for so long. Isaiah's battle wasn't over, but he wasn't fighting it alone anymore, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was truly home. Isaiah's resilience in the face of adversity showed the world that one man's courage could spark a movement. His story, once a symbol of injustice, became a beacon of hope, proving that even in the darkest of times, change is possible. And for Isaiah Johnson, a black veteran who had once been invisible, the world was finally watching.